Well, it's now my great pleasure to welcome everyone and also to welcome our special speaker this evening, Dr. Adrian Jones, retired Professor of European History at La Trobe University, somebody who is often on ABC Radio. Adrian has degrees from the University of Melbourne, from La Trobe University, and a PhD from Harvard, and he is specialised in Russian, French, and Balkan history. Adrian has published many articles, and he leads tours to Russia, Romania, Macedonia, Slovenia, all sorts of interesting parts of Europe. Coming up, Adrian has some fascinating tours with ASA. This September, and again in the year 2026, he is doing Istanbul in depth. This September, October, and again in 2026, along the Via Nati, Macedonia, Albania, and Corfu. Then in May, June of next year, Romania revealed, and in September of next year, his tour of Slovenia. But this evening, Adrian is going to be talking to us about beautiful Slovenia, Slavic microcosm of optimism and resilience. So I'd like now to welcome Dr. Adrian Jones.
Thanks very much, Susanna. Yes, I'm a specialist in all those parts of Europe that are kind of hard to spell and hard to remember where they are. And one of these is Slovenia, a lovely little tiny destination. It's a small place, and we dwell in this place for 2 weeks. It's 2.5 million people, a small area. We're not rushing, and we get the chance to really explore. So there's sometimes a really good way to travel is to just to tarry in a small place for a longer time. So with Slovenia, and this is not Slovakia, which is the place between Romania and Hungary, in the east of Hungary. We're looking at a country that's west of Hungary and south of Austria. It's a small country with big mountains, lush valleys, deep caves, and a very distinct Slavonic or Slavic culture. And that's how I came to be interested in it, because I trained as a Turkologist and as a Slavic studies professor. So it's a small country with big mountains, lush valleys, a distinct Slavic culture and deep caves. And they're the kind of key things. So it's a very scenic and beautiful place. And we go over some of the most youngest Alps in Europe, the so-called Julian Alps. So you've got some of the youngest mountains in Europe with these dramatic landscapes. Now let me introduce you to my kind of 6 or 7 key points that I would make. We're talking about a country with 2.1 million people, a lovely capital of 600,000, but a beautiful town called Ljubljana. And the key theme for me, in a way, as a Slavicist, is that we're looking at a people who are the westernmost of the Slavic speakers. They're jammed up right next to the Italians and the Germans and the Hungarians. So west to Italy, north to German speakers in Austria, east to Hungarians, and then south to another form of Slavic speaker, the Croatians. And this is one of the great mysteries, is that they were dominated by other people's empires, whether Roman, ancient Roman, with the language of Latin and then Italian, and then German for well over a millennium. And yet they are still speaking Slavs, a Slavonic language. So 2 million people with their own language, surviving, surrounded by these other supposedly more powerful cultures. So we get to a kind of theme in my talk, is that we're dealing with a youthful, optimistic, innovative, resilient, and some say lucky, but certainly a plucky people and a place. It's interesting because it's so culturally and linguistically diverse. We're talking about a borderland. And I think often these are the most interesting places to travel, like Strasbourg in the Franco-German places, or Belgium. And Slovenia is one of these places where you've got a mix of cultures, and they're not so full of themselves that they think they've always been the top. It's a land populated since the 8th century by Slavs who have never been swamped, as have happened to, say, the Slavs in Germany, the so-called Sorbs and Wends, many of whom came to South Australia to live in the Barossa Valley. They were so put upon in Germany, Slavic speakers in Germany, in Silesia and Lower Saxony, Sorbs and Wends. But these Slovenians managed to hold on to their culture and identity and their language, and that is one of the most extraordinary things to notice as we travel through this region. They were touched and dominated by Rome, and then by the Holy Roman Empire with its various German capitals, and then by the Habsburgs for nearly 800 years. And then they were part of a Yugoslav Slavonic Federation. And then there's a lucky revolution where in 1991, they win their independence. And since 2004, they've been in the European Union. And in 2007, they're in the Schengen zone, so fully part of Europe. And we've got a beautiful, small country, easy to travel, youthful, optimistic, innovative, resilient, lucky. Take hilltop Skopje Loka, for example, where we venture when we leave Ljubljana for the very first time. We've got a 10th century Slavic settlement sitting on a hilltop. It was ruled by the Holy Roman Empire fief, run by the bishops from Freising in Bavaria. But when we visit the castle, we notice how the Skopjelokans are a stroppy Slav craftspeople, ready to insist on their own customs and rights, and they founded a wonderful school for girls. So we've got a window here in this lovely castle on top of the hill, down on the vibrant town, and you can see it pictured there. And they're strong believers in education and strong believers in their crafts, skills, and language. They could have easily converted to kind of Germanic culture, but they resist. If we look at the region, it was once part of Yugoslavia. So when Yugoslavia broke apart, starting in around about 1987, 88, when the Serb part becomes more and more assertive and trying to dominate the other parts, and as more and more people, particularly in non-Serb parts, begin to doubt, and in Serbia itself, the relevance of communism, the whole thing in Yugoslavia breaks apart. And the Slovenians were luckier than most because they were able to declare their independence in June 1991. Some tanks came from Belgrade to try and deter them, but within 10 days they had achieved their independence. The Serbs decided that they had bigger fish to fry and they wanted to focus much more on trying to carve up Croatia, Bosnia, and Kosovo. And so, in a sense, Slovenia was lucky it inherited independence without the struggle that so dominated Croatia and Bosnia and Kosovo in the next 10 to 20 years in the 1990s and in the 2000s in Kosovo. So we've got a haven for freedom, optimism and youth. And so when we go to Slovenia, you'll find that lots of other people from former Yugoslavia are living and working there because in Slovenia, you have a lot more opportunities and a lot more scope for innovation. So we've got a Yugoslav heritage, lightly warm. Let's think about Ljubljana, the lovely capital. We've got 2.1 million people in Slovenia as a whole, but only 600,000 in the capital, Ljubljana. So it's a little charmer of a town. It dates from the Roman era. It sits on a Roman road network, which I'll show you later. And we'll walk over that Roman road in the basement of the local city museum when we visit Ljubljana. So we're on the Roman road from Italy to Hungary and beyond to Romania. And Ljubljana changes then in the era of the Holy Roman Empire when the focus shifts from the riverbank. So the Romans built on the riverbank. In fact, not far from the right bank in my photo here. Over here was the Roman capital. But in the barbarian era of the Holy Roman Empire, the centre of gravity shifts to the top of the hill, which is a kind of classical European pattern. And the city is first dominated from the Veneto, from the Venice region, before Venice existed, the so-called Duchy or Prince Bishopric of Aquileia, and then in the Holy Roman Empire, under the Sponheim family from the Rhineland, they have a fief here. And then from 1278 to 1918, the city is part of the Habsburg Empire with its capital in Vienna. But this lovely river here, the Ljubljanica, lovely Slavonic word, the little river of Ljubljana, it's a mystery because it arises out of a cave only 30 kilometres to the east of the capital. So you've got this extraordinary country where the great river of the capital comes out of a cave and no one can see where the water came in till much, much later. So this is Ljubljana. And here we see some images of the overlapping images of the town. You've got a town, a beautiful Central European town, which is relatively unspoiled, wasn't particularly bombed in the Second World War, and managed to survive in many ways. You've got a series of different kind of influences. So you've got a kind of Germanic Hungarian kind of style of townhouse where a wagon could go through a wide gate and in behind would be a courtyard. There'd be a house over the gate and a doorway with 2 or 3 floors, an attic and a cellar. Then you've got overlays of 19th century neo-Gothic sensibility that you kind of would find in London in the Palace of Westminster, that other great neo-Gothic English castle. And then you've got a third overlay of Italian, Roman, Palladian, Renaissance colonnades and arches. So we've got a place that's very multicultural in its architectural traditions and its sensibilities, its cuisine, of course, but it's dominated by Slavic speakers who in a way shouldn't be there. They should have been dominated by Latin speakers or by German speakers because they've been part of their empires for so long, and yet no way. These people are proudly independent and maintained their dignity and kept to their traditions. So we're looking at a place that's a bit like the Scots in relation to the English, or like the Hungarians and the Austrians. They might be working together in the same empire, but they're still bloody different. So we'll spend the day exploring the heritage of this architecture, looking at the architecture of a famed Central European architect, Josip Plečnik, who left his mark all over his home city, Ljubljana, as well as in Prague and Vienna. So here we have the kind of classic pattern that again that I referred to, the kind of ancient Roman town. Town was down there on the plain. The river you can see at the foot of the hill just between the medieval town, and then the medieval town is dominated by the castle and the fortifications around the castle. The German word for Ljubljana is Laibach, and in fact an indication of the kind of strength of this independent culture is the fact that a rock band in Yugoslavia, one of the most popular Yugoslav rock bands was from Ljubljana, called itself Laibach, and their rock lyrics in the 1980s were particularly powerful in undermining communism in Yugoslavia and indeed right across Eastern Europe. So we've got a place that's famed for its independence and its resilience, even if it was dominated by another empire. It preserves its language and culture. And we've also got a place in Ljubljana where we'll see that it's shaped by some of the great European intellectual trends, particularly the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, and the Enlightenment. We'll walk in the steps of some of Habsburg Slovenia's greatest intellectuals. One of them is the guy who ordered the drawing of this engraving of the 18th century city, Johann Weichard von Valvassor, who was made a member of the Royal Society for his study of caves and is a specialist in what we call chorography, the particular deep study of a whole region, a classic kind of European Enlightenment project where you looked at history, geography, science, natural history, all together. That's Valvassor. But we've also got a place that's really interesting, particularly in the towns when we go there, that they were a pillar of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. So this is one of the first places, particularly in Central Europe, to go strongly Protestant, even though the Habsburg Empire was determinedly Catholic. And so there is a counter reaction in the 17th century, and the people are pushed back into the Catholic Church with some resistance, but there's a certain pragmatism in Slovenia. They know the way power is going in Vienna and they just bend with the wind, but they preserve their distinct Slavic culture and traditions. So we know some famous people in Slovenia. Remember, only 2.1 million people, only 600,000 in Ljubljana, but we've got really some small fish in very big ponds. Not only some of the leaders of the Protestant Reformation, but a 4-time winner of the Tour de France, and of course someone who the President of the United States is married to, Melania Trump. So we've got people who are very focused on European and global perspectives because they are a small people in the European model, and their cuisine will reflect something of the same. They're proudly Slavonic, but they cook as if they were German, Austrian, Hungarian, or Italian. And so the best of all three come together. They chose to write their Slav since the 10th century using Latin letters, whereas other Slavs, apart from the Poles and the Croatians, use Cyrillic letters or Russian-style letters. So you see there's a certain pragmatism, a certain what you might call realism, that, you know, they might be dominated by another empire, but they're going to continue to do things in their own way. So we look at some wonderfully beautiful places like Lake Bled in the northwest, with its beautiful island in the middle of the lake, and then its castle rearing above. So you've got a castle here, which is part of the Holy Roman Empire in the 11th century, 12th century, which was one of the castles that possibly the troubadours sang when they were looking for Richard the Lionheart. Remember that Richard the Lionheart, the English king who went to the Crusades, is returning, and he fell out with the Holy Roman Emperor. And in 1192, he's captured and held prisoner in a castle somewhere in this region of Austria and Slovenia. And in order to find him, a minstrel went from castle to castle, and certainly would have gone to Lake Bled, because the king, Richard, was captured after his ship was wrecked on the northern Adriatic storm. So he was dragged into Central Europe. And what he did, this minstrel, was he sang, called Roland or Boland, I think. He sang outside each castle wall an English song until he heard the Richard the Lionheart respond, and then they knew where he was. And this is one of the castles. But the island in the middle was even older. It was part of the Slavic pagan traditions from the 7th, 8th and 9th centuries, but they converted to Christianity in the 8th and 9th century here. So we've got a place with wonderful castles, beautiful lakes, and lovely traditions. We've also got a place with a gorgeous culinary tradition, and you can see in a way which parts are kind of Balkan and which parts are cream cake Viennese Austrian, including the famous Lake Bled vanilla tart here on the left-hand lower side. But some really wonderful food, and you know, I really enjoy this tour because we get to eat in some really innovative restaurants with blending the best of Central European, Balkan, and Italian influences. And so we come to Piran, a beautiful town. So we've got all sorts kinds of areas in this. So this tour will go northwest from the mountains, and Slovenia has a small, tiny part on the Adriatic coast, which was given to them after the settlements at the end of the two world wars. And this is one of those places, Piran, the lovely shore of the Adriatic Sea. And we've got a wonderfully place of Venetian coast. We could be in Ravenna, we could be in Venice in a way, but it's a town that even predates Venice, but with a lovely Italian feel about it. But we're in Slovenia, in a Slovenian-speaking population. If we just went another 10 or 15 kilometres or so to the north, we'd be in Trieste, which is another one of these places. Now, Piran in particular, for those who love Baroque music, is associated with Giuseppe Tartini, the great Baroque composer, who was born in Piran but came to work in Venice alongside people like Vivaldi. And so we also have then another interesting place. We're east now of Slovenia, and we see this wonderful castle perched on a hill with, again, another Central European style town with an older medieval tower in the middle, dating from earlier than this castle. This is in central eastern Slovenia, and this is the castle of the Counts of Celje. So here we have a Slavic language where the C's are pronounced T-S, Celje. So we've got a place, and these Counts of Celje were the most significant rivals of the Habsburg Empire until the middle of the 15th century, and they played a prominent role in association with kings of Hungary and whatsoever, and Poland. So we have a kind of rival of the Habsburgs, which the Habsburgs only managed to control from the middle of the 15th century. So, to sum up, we've got Slovenia is a land of verdant valleys, lakes and caves and beautiful escarpments. It combines the best of Roman, Venetian, Balkan, Austrian heritage, not only in architecture, but also in cuisine. So when we travel down the east, we go down the Socha River, which is one of the great battlegrounds of the First World War, where they fight 12 battles between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Italian Empire between 1915 and 1917, in the very end of 1917, ending in the Great Battle of Caporetto or Kolbarid, a town we visit. So we see this wonderful Socha River, which is one of the great rivers. Okay, so let me now try and describe the tour in a little more detail. After spending about 4 days in Ljubljana, we basically head northwest up into the mountains, and we stay at Lake Bled and spend some time one day in a lovely little mining town and craftsman's town called Tržić. And then we move off from Bled up into the mountains to Lake Bohinj, which we'll see, cross the top of the mountains over the Vršić Pass, have lunch in a little lovely mountain town, Bovec, and then go to the Battle Museum at Kolbarid or Caporetto, and then have a hike in the little long walk in the morning in the rugged gorge at Tolmin. And then we come past down along the Socha River into the lower lands. And when they fought the battles in the First World War, they fought all the way along this line that we're kind of following. So we're following the Socha River. And then we'll go down all the way to Piran. We'll see the Lipizzaner horses, the famous Austrian dancing horses, which came from Slovenia before they ever went to Vienna. The horses were trained in Slovenia and were actually Slovenian horses. And then after we've been on the coast in Piran, at the little sliver of coast, because remember on my map here, Trieste is part of Italy and has been so after crises at the end of the First World War and at the end of the Second World War as well. And so Trieste was carved out of Slovenia and given to Italy after those two wars, but Piran is the one little bit left for Slovenia. In the second half of the tour, we will go again past a lovely medieval church which has one of the few medieval frescoes of the Dance of Death, which is a kind of reminder to powerful people that they're going to die, and that it's a kind of subversive Roman Catholic fresco. We're going to go through the cave districts, Postojna, and then on skirting past Ljubljana to Celje that I was talking about before, and then on to the slightly more Hungarian, flatter parts at Tui and Maribor, and then we will go south and then on to Otocec, a lovely castle, another river, the Krka River, where we will have a glorious lunch, and then we will end the tour with 2 or 3 days in Zagreb, crossing the border. Now Croatia is part of the Schengen zone. The typical tour of Slovenia, if you look at the map, will go, to 3 places on 3 nights. Ljubljana, Lake Bled, and Postojna. But we're doing so much more. Let me now try to take you a little deeper into the kind of Slovenian scene. If we look at it, because every place doesn't necessarily correspond to its current boundaries, but basically many of the places in the west, in the mountains that we'll go to, with the border with Italy and with Croatia in the so-called Istrian Peninsula here, and the Italian, the Socha Valley coming down here. The current borders of Slovenia are tighter because large parts in the west and the south were allocated to Italy. And so there was an exchange of populations that many Slovenians living in the High Veneto had to leave and came back to Slovenia, and many Italians living in and around Western Slovenia had to move towards Italy. And if you ask Italian migrants or Slovenian migrants in Melbourne or places like in Australia, often they'll tell you that they were those people who had to move and were displaced. And then you've got the strong German influence to the north. Okay, so we've got a region of beautiful valleys, lakes, caves, and escarpments. And we can see it here represented in this lovely 18th century engraving of the town of Celje, and it's linked to the castle up high here, but now not so relevant. And we've got an area which is defined by open fields, but also half as much by pasture land. So Slovenia is an area of a kind of pastoral economy assisted by vineyards and grain cropping in very fertile lands. But also what you're seeing now in the past is that the highlands were often grazed and so were much less wooded than they are today in the past, which is true throughout the Balkan. We're looking at a region of wonderful wines, and some of the great wines usually in the Italian style, but because of the strong influence from the west, from the Veneto, but also these distinct wine regions. And we will go through each of these so you get a chance to sample these wines. The Vipava Valley, the Istrian wines, the wines in the green, the so-called Stajerska wines, Stajerska, each of these distinct wine regions. So we'll be going through those. And here's the castle that I was talking about you on the River Krka. And we will cross a little footbridge onto this beautiful island where the river bifurcates. And inside the castle courtyard, there's a wonderful gourmet restaurant run by a very classy hotel. And we'll also be walking on the River Krka, which flows down to the castle I just mentioned. And so you've got a beautiful village, which is set up as a market town in the early medieval period. And it's not far from this glorious 12th century Cistercian abbey, founded by the kings of Hungary who dominated the region then. So you've got this neo-colonial history where you had Cistercian monks coming from Burgundy with the encouragement of Hungarian kings to settle this region. They're specialist agricultural silent monks. And then when the monastery comes or the castle comes, then the market town arrives, and we'll walk around this lovely little market town and have some morning coffee. Okay, and so here we have the castle at Lake Bled, where we will start our journey in Bled. We'll arrive there, and the next morning we'll row out on rowboats. We're not rowing onto the island, the Bleški Otok. So it's a really beautiful place. When we go from Bled, we'll take a day and we'll go high into the mountains, and we'll go up onto Lake Bohinj, a beautiful freshwater lake. And at the head of the lake is a lovely old church, Catholic church, with some glorious kind of naive medieval frescoes that we'll see inside that church and cross over this lovely old stone bridge. And here we see the lake that I just spoke about. viewed from the top of the cable car at Mount Vogel, where we'll go up and have some lunch beyond the tree line at the most spectacular setting. And down below here is the little village that I was just pointing to you with the stone church with the really old frescoes. We'll go underground because the area is dominated by casts, and one of the less often visited is the Scotchyard Cave. It's beautiful. We do a long walk through chamber after chamber. This is just one of those chambers. And the whole region is the so-called karst region. So in the middle of western central Slovenia, just on the lee side of the mountain, the Julian Alps, is this extraordinary region of hollow river valleys where the rivers disappear underground and pop up, just like the Ljubljanica does in the capital of Ljubljana. So you have this extraordinary karst region. And inside it is one of my favourite places in Slovenia, this extraordinary castle built between the 11th and the 15th centuries in a cliff. And we'll tell some interesting stories about the last duke who didn't manage to survive a Habsburg siege because he made the mistake of going to the one toilet in the castle, which was vulnerable to attack, the one place in the castle, and when he was killed while he was sitting on the toilet. It's a kind of drop toilet. And here we see the Enlightenment intellectual Balvasor, who's one of the first to actually explain how caves work and to explore them systematically with this wonderful drawing which he made, which helped him win the Royal Society Prize in England in 1687. So we've got an area which is surrounded by different states. Remember, 2 million people, not many great distances, and with extraordinary linguistic diversity. So you can see that when you go west, you've got a mix of Italian and Slovenian. If you go north, German and Slovenian. East, Hungarian and Slovenian. If you go across south to Croatia, you've got slightly different versions of a Slavonic language. And we've got an extraordinary linguistic diversity here looming around. So the Germanic speakers, kind of yellow. The Slovenes here are in their light green colour. The Croatian speakers, different kind of Slavonic language with also regional dialects, more regional dialects than in Slovenia, with their light blue colour. Hungarian speakers with their red, and of course Italians to the west. So it's this diversity. It's a borderland. It makes it really interesting to travel. And we can see that here we are in looking towards the border. So if we think about, we'll travel right along this valley when we go to Tržić and Bled, and basically the border with Austria is right along the top of that ridge, all the way along. So you can think about the place we just went is sort of along here. And the good thing about this journey is that no place is very distant. You know, we're 140, 120 kilometres from one place to the other is about all we would do in a day. So plenty of time to relax. The other extraordinary thing about Slovenia is that they found in a cave in Slovenia, and we'll see it in the National Museum, the oldest musical instrument found in the world. We're looking at the 60th to 50th centuries BCE. A Neanderthal had carved a bone flute, and you can hear it when we go in the museum. So that this is one of the most significant archaeological finds in the sense that you've got here Neanderthal people who are capable of making music and have deliberately carved a bone of a bear to make a bone flute. Slovenia became important in the Roman world because it was the site of a chain of castles meant to defend Rome from Roman invasion. So here we see one of those castles at Ajdovščina. And here we see the kind of chain of castles that they built and the Roman roads that we're kind of going to follow, where the Romans are coming from Aquileia here across into, but this is before Ljubljana emerges as a significant capital. It is a Roman base, but not the most significant one. In the Roman times, that's Ptuj and Maribor, Ljubljana. So let's give you a sample of it. With Piran, with its Italian feel, with Celje Castle, with again its kind of medieval heritage and history. It's one of the best preserved medieval castles in Europe. If we go back to Ljubljana, we're thinking about the heritage, wonderful, what we might call the Art Nouveau heritage of Jože Plečnik that I referred to before, with these wonderful buildings, the Flatiron building here, the bridge here, which has three different levels or three different roads going through it. Then there's an interesting communist heritage to kind of think about, that Yugoslav communism, and particularly this man on the left of Tito, was the architect of the distinct model of Yugoslav communism, talking about worker self-management, sama uprava, so that the Yugoslav communists were some of the more innovative figures in European communism, trying to work on a model where you had collective management of an industrial enterprise or a city council or whatever. We've got an emphasis in Slovenia on the everyman quality, which is kind of similar to in Australia in some way. And I think in many ways Australians and Slovenes are similar in the sense that they don't big night themselves. And so here we see a war memorial with this emphasis on the resistance in the Second World War, not on the great leaders, but on the every bloke who had to survive Nazi domination and Italian domination. Or the gateway to the parliament, which used to be the Slovene regional parliament under communism, but is now the national parliament after 1991. And you see this interesting naked communist sculptures where they're looking at all these people doing different trades and different roles. So it's an interesting nudist communist culture. And we'll walk past that and discuss that when we're on our way to various sites. The Slovene values, or kind of everyman values, are summed up in Slovene folk heroes. For example, there's this guy, the Slovene giant, Martin Kirpan, who picks up the emperor's carriage when he gets bogged on the road, and the emperor is amazed that he's able to pick up the whole carriage, and then he hires him to do battle with an Ottoman hero, and they do battle in front of the armies. So it's a story about an everyday backwoodsman who can do the job, classic Slovene. But he doesn't surrender his Slovene identity, and he goes back laden with gifts from the emperor, but he's still working as a log man cutting logs. And there's a similar story in Slovenia too about Peter Krepec, a little shepherd boy who's bullied and by all the people and called a weakling, but then he helps a fairy who's sick in the forest, and the fairy gives him amazing strength, which he uses to defeat the Ottoman enemies of the Slovenes. So again, it's a kind of tough guy. You think I'm weak, but I'm strong, really. And there's distinctive Slovene cultures. They've got their own traditions. So they love pork sausages, and they have a festival, a religious festival where they auction pork sausages. God knows why. It's again a reaffirmation of their distinct traditions. And my last point wants to point to one of the great writers that nobody reads because he chose to write in Slovene and not in German. But he was really one of the great writers of the late 19th century, very early 20th century, Ivan Sankar. And he writes really powerful. He's influenced by Tolstoy, but also influenced by Bohemian culture. He writes a very strong critical realist novels about injustice in the 20th century world. And he chooses to do so in Slovene, and basically how the world is put upon. So he writes some very powerful stories about human rights, about justice and social justice and poverty in the 20th century world. He reminds me of Zola or Gorky or some of the great writers of that late 19th century, early 20th century period. So let me finish by saying I think it's a really good place to visit. You'll get short distances, lots of lovely things to eat and see, lots of great scenery. You're amongst the people who are proudly stuck to their traditions, even though many other peoples would have been dominated by Germany or by Italian and Latin. No, they stay strong to their traditions, and that's an amazing quality to find. You're looking at a borderland where it's very hard to find a bad meal, a fresh and optimistic place, strongly European, but with a strong sense of its own identity as well. But doesn't have tickets on itself, doesn't say that it invented everything, and a really lovely place to relax, just like these boats on Lake Bohinj. So I hope I've introduced you to Slovenia.
Thank you so much, Adrian. That was a really interesting talk. You began by saying that Slovenia was a very plucky country, and I think you showed that in so many interesting ways. The way it's held on to its language, its culture, its heritage. It was a really fascinating talk. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I'm sure people will have some questions they would like to ask, so let's throw it open to questions.
Adrian, I have a comment rather than a question, having had the opportunity to visit Slovenia 3 times.
Oh, great.
And 2 of those reasons is because of their lace making. And Slovenia has hosted the International Bobbin and Needle Lace Organisations Conference in 2016 and 2023 in Ljubljana and Nova Gorica. And I think the Congress illustrated what you talked about, the innovation and the enthusiasm of Slovenia. And the other thing I would say is that I absolutely love Alpina shoes. So if anybody is visiting Slovenia, make sure you've got enough room to buy a couple of pairs of shoes. So they're my 2 reflections that are in addition to what you have said. So thank you.
Lovely point. When we go to Tržić, we go, from Lake Bled, we're based in Bled, and we spend one day and we go east from Bled, then up into the mountains in actually one of the invasion routes for the Wehrmacht in 1941. But we go to Tržić, and that's famous for its lace makers and its shoemakers. They're both in that town. And we go to the lovely little provincial museum there, where they're very proud of those things, and they talk to us about them. Yeah, so you're good to remind me about that, yes.
At our conference in 2016, we met the mayor at that museum, and he did reflect on disappointment that a number of the shoes were now being manufactured in China, and as much as possible they were still making the shoes in the village.
Yes, but you do go into that little museum and see how the shoes are made, and yes, and all the entrepreneurship that went with that. Yes. And of course, they wanted that location because to make the leather in particular, you needed fast-flowing rivers that would deal with all the waste that comes with leather making. But now those rivers are crystal clean. So there is a plus side to the loss of the shoe industry, at least.
Yes.
Yes, at least.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
It was fantastic. Thank you so much, Adrian. It was really informative. I wanted to just mention I'm half Czech, and you mentioned Czech language. They from the Latin, not the Cyrillic.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah, and I noticed you had the name called the Kirk River. Was it Kirk?
Yeah.
Kirk means in Slavic languages it means neck.
Yes. That's
Anyway,
right.
look, it sounds fantastic.
Well, I came to it from Russian because I learned Russian as a Russianist, and so these are distinct traditions, yes. But then I did Balkan field as a student. But yes, Kirk means neck, yeah.
I paid a fleeting visit to Slovenia once years ago and remember a very big cave system, but we went around on a little train. Is that the same one that you mentioned?
Well, that's the one most visited, Postojna, and yes, there's a lovely underground train, and it's very easy to go. And we do that one, but we also do the Skofjoloka cave, which we do on foot, going from massive chamber to chamber. So there are 2 massive cave systems that we visit. So the Postojna is the oldest one, and it has a little post office underneath. You'd love to go there and get their stamp postmarked in the Postojna cave. But they're both wonderful caves. Postojna is a slightly more easier to navigate. There's fewer steps, but they're both wonderful caves. And Valvassor, the great Enlightenment regional geographer and natural scientist, and he found in the caves this legless kind of lizard creature called the that lives in the cave.
Make it all sound utterly fascinating and deserving of more time than I spent.
Oh, well, no. Well, I think that's one of the good things about this too, is we do have the time to just not go too far in a day and really do some good stuff and still eat really well and have a coffee and, linger around there and go to some little provincial museums and things like that.
Apart from Ljubljana and I think it was Chelcior, which I know are Roman cities, do we see other Roman areas?
Yes, we do, because in Ljubljana itself, you go to the city museum, which was basically a compound fortified complex built by the Teutonic Knights when they were there in the early part. So after they left Jerusalem, they came to Central Europe and the popes hired them out. They were in Ljubljana under their castle complex, where there's now a theatre complex. There is the city museum with its complete excavation of a Roman road and adjacent townhouses and cities and then stuff brought in from villas. So Ljubljana is a very important site, but so is Ptuj. And so we go there and see their stuff in the local museum as well. And then when you go along some of these other sites, we get various glimpses of Roman sites. So yes, and I end up speaking quite a lot as we're going around about Roman things and the Roman towns. And
the photo, I think it might have been a sketch of the plan, looked exactly like a Roman fort laid out, and that was Celje. I can't think how that's pronounced, but
yes, so Celje is another one of these Roman towns, and there's the kind of classic medieval pattern that you find in Anatolia as well, that the Romans were living right beside the river, or they fortified a bridge or whatever, but then in the late Roman Empire they have to defend themselves more vigorously against barbarian attack, so they start to pull back and build fortified places on tops of hills, and that sets the medieval pattern. And so we see both kinds of settlement in Slovenia.
I'm packing already.
Well, Adrian, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating lecture on Slovenia. It certainly makes me want to go back to the country, and I'm sure it's made many others very keen indeed to get to see that lovely, historic, intriguing part of the world. Thank you so much from all of us.
Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you, Adrian. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Adrian.